Hi, this is Mike Ignatowski, the creator of the GreenFox Spreadsheet, the spreadsheet that uses Excel programming to make the spreadsheet behave like an electronic baseball scoresheet or scorebook, and it automatically computes the game stats, which can be a big time saver. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you find this video helpful.
In this video, I want to talk about GreenFox version 3 and its landmark feature of a custom league. And in this video, it will not be a step-by-step how-to video in GreenFox, but more of a conceptual overview step-by-step when it comes to this custom league. And that's because the custom league can take many forms, and therefore I feel like I could better cover the capabilities of GreenFox and a custom league in this conceptual presentation format as opposed to a step-by-step in the spreadsheet itself. I will make at least one step-by-step video making a custom league, but it'll only be one specific type of custom league, whereas this video will cover all types. Why make a custom league in GreenFox? Well, the main reason is up until now, GreenFox could track cumulative stats for leagues that were based on historical schedules, whether it's for a historical team season replay or a historical season replay of an entire year for all teams. But there are many other baseball sim projects out there that don't follow one of those two formats, and that's really where the custom league comes in. It can do, I don't want to say anything, but I'll say almost anything beyond those historical types of leagues. And it's all contained in a single spreadsheet. As it says here on point 1, it's not specific to whatever sim game you're using, Atlas, Stratomatic, Status Pro, whatever. You should be able to use all of them with GreenFox. And in general, you can see in point 2, some of these league parameters are from 2 to 64 teams. They can be historical teams, like the 1973 Oakland A's, or fictional teams. It has the concept of these sub-leagues, like American and National, divisions within the sub-leagues of 1 to 4, a schedule that the user will have to provide, flexible rosters of historical players or fictional players. It can handle lefty-righty lineups or games that have what they call lefty-righty split stats or split outcomes. And it also has the other features that GreenFox has had in previous versions, which is the built-in score sheet where you can score your game and it'll compute the game stats. And now it'll also compute and track all the cumulative stats for every player and every team in your league. And the last thing I want to reiterate is it does require a full version of Excel for the programming to work. This will not run on Google Sheets. During the process of adding this custom league feature into GreenFox, I've kind of come to the conclusion that it's accomplished in what I'm going to call 4 or 5 stages. And I've listed those stages here, with the first part being the league structure or layout. And now I think an easier way to understand that would be the standings view. That kind of shows where your teams are and what the layout is of those teams in your league. And the second point being the rosters of your team, which really is the bread and butter of your league, are the players. Point 3, those split stats, the lefty-righty question of whether that makes a difference in your league. And the associated component of that is your team lineups or your default lineups. The fourth stage is the schedule, which is quite flexible in here, although it's quite manual because this custom league does not provide a schedule creator. So you'll have to, the user needs to provide the schedule, but it doesn't have to have it all figured out. at the beginning. You can create the schedule as you go, or you can put it in all at once. It's up to you. And the last stage, which is totally optional, is using the custom player ratings feature of GreenFox that has been in there really since the beginning of the GreenFox spreadsheet. So now let's go through each of these in a little more detail. And there'll be several screenshots of how these are accomplished in GreenFox. So let's look in the stage 1, which is this league structure or the standings view. And here are the various parts of that with the league name and ID, an optional league description. Those things are pretty much superficial and behind the scenes, but they are necessary, at least the league ID. But again, it's not really something you have to worry about much. The number of teams, 2 to 64, which is, I think, should be broad enough to handle most situations. The team name and IDs, the main thing there is that you want to make them unique and so that they make sense to you. The names and how many subleagues do you want? You only have the choice of 1 or 2, so that's not going to be too big of a problem, but the examples would be like the American and National League would be subleagues. And the number of divisions per subleague, that can be up 1 to 4. The names of your divisions, and then you have to assign your teams to the divisions. So let's take a look at GreenFox itself and see how does that look in the actual spreadsheet. So this is showing it for the league sheet, the league tab within GreenFox, and I've kind of highlighted the 3 areas where you define these various settings. Here's where you'd set your league name and ID, the number of teams. Here's really where you start, is this mode where you say I want custom league mode, and everything else kind of follows from there. But here's the number of subleagues, the number of divisions per subleague. Here's where you enter your team names and give your teams their ID and assign them a division. We'll talk more about this later. And over here on the right, this is where you'd provide the names of your sub-league or leagues and divisions. And once you enter how many sub-leagues and divisions per sub-league here, this will kind of somewhat auto-populate. It would fill in all the ones that aren't applicable with this NA for not applicable. You can see here the only 2 that aren't would be the L sub-league and the division L1. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the last thing I'll mention here is this thing that's cut off, but this does have the basic steps to follow in how to create a custom league if you're not sure what to do. Now the next thing I want to show is a little bit of a detour, but I think it's worth mentioning, is on many of these sheets within GreenFox where you're configuring your league, there are cells with these little red triangles in the upper right corner, and those indicate that there's effectively a hidden note, like a post-it note within that cell, and you can see it when you hover your mouse over that cell. This example here is if you hover your mouse on this divisions per sub-league cell, it would show you this pop-up window that looks kind of like a post-it note and tell you information about it. So it's quite helpful and informative, and I would encourage you to take advantage of that information in there. It just provides some helpful documentation and explanation of what type of data it's looking for in a certain area on the spreadsheet. And this is from the league sheet that we just saw, but there are also cells like this on the schedule, or it's called the sched or shed sheet, the roster sheet, the MPL, which is the master player list sheet, and the LG lineup, which is for your league team lineup sheet. They all have some cells with these hidden notes behind them, so I would encourage you to take advantage of those. So let's take a look at how this all comes together in the standings view within the GreenFox spreadsheet itself. So this is the standings sheet within GreenFox, and you can see up here in this slide title where I said this is a full league structure, and what I mean by that is it has 2 divisions, 2 sub-leagues and 2 divisions per sub-league. So it has all the parts. So let's just kind of look at how this shows up. You can see here this My 12 Team League is the name of my league. This Oldies League and Not As Old League are the names of my sub-leagues shown here. If you look at the bottom here, the left side of the standings is referred to as the L sub-league. It's kind of boring, but it makes sense since it's on the left. And then on the right sub-league is called the R sub-league, and it's over here on this side. So no matter what, you'll always have the standings will always show the L sub-league and the R sub-league, even if you're not using the R sub-league. It'll just be blank. And if we talk about the divisions per sub-league, this has two, and you can see here each division here on the in the L sub-league, their names are the red division and the blue. And this first one is the L1 division because it's on the part of the L or the left sub-league, and it's the first division. So this is L1, L2. If there were others, it'd be L3 and L4 below. And similarly over here, this is division R1 and R2, and they're the black and the gold division. So that's a picture of how it looks in the standings sheet itself. The next one I want to show you is another example of another custom league standings view, but this one, as you see in the title here, I call it the simple league structure, which is one sub-league and one division. So this is, I would call it a simplified version, and therefore the standings look simpler. So this is just my two-team league. That's the name of my league. And you can see here, as I mentioned here, it has the left or the L sub-league and the R sub-league, but the R sub-league is not used, so it's just empty. And over here on the left, the L sub-league, you can see it doesn't even show the name of the sub-league. And that's what this button up here can do, which it'll hide it because it's basically redundant. I already have, this is the name of my league, and my L sub-league would probably be the same name. And similarly, the division, I can name it the same thing. But that's just a lot of redundancy. So you can use this button to hide the name of your sub-leagues if you don't want them, if they don't really provide any useful information, like in this case. And here, I think it defaults to, if you only have one division in one sub-league, it just calls the name of that division team. So it doesn't look so out of place. It's helpful, but it doesn't really provide any useful information because having this one division, it's really just your league, so you don't really need a name of a division. So anyway, that's how it looks in kind of a very simple league structure. Okay, now on to stage two, which is the team rosters, which really is the best part of any league are the players. And so I'll reiterate, I think on this and other slides, that all players in a custom league have to have unique lineup names and unique IDs. So they both need to be unique, and that's really just so that it's easy for you to visually keep track of who's who, and for the GreenFox stats engine under the hood to be able to tell every player apart. So as I was working on this and thinking about these different rosters, I kind of made up this slide to describe the different types of rosters, and I hope this doesn't seem a bit too scary, or there's not going to be any quiz on it, but it's really just a way I could organize my thoughts of different types of rosters and how they're made up of what types of players. In this first group are historical team rosters, which can be from a single season or multiple seasons. And so in the single season scenario, you might have a league that says, I just want to choose the top 4 teams of 1984. And these would be, real teams with real historical rosters. Similarly, in the multiple season version, you could pick different teams from different years, and you put those in a single league. The second group I'm calling custom rosters And within that, there's a couple of groups. There's custom rosters of historical players, which are, I think, what we're most common with, real players. And within that, if I'm using historical players in my league, I might have created my league by having a draft of a single season. Like I had a draft of my 1975 players, and I'll make my own teams, maybe 4 teams, 6 teams, 8 teams, whatever you want to have. But all those players are real players that I have from 1975 season. To make it a little more complicated, you might say, well, I'm going to have a custom draft, but using all seasons from the 50s, all 10 years, that those players are going to be available to make my teams. And if you do that, you have to figure out whether you're going to allow just one version of each player. And I say version, one season. So let's say, like, as shown here, Willie Mays, if you play the 50s, there's going to be several Willie Mays seasons, or cards, or whatever you have. And you have to figure out or determine whether you're going to allow just one Willie Mays in your league, one season, or whether you're going to allow each Willie Mays season to be in your league. That's up to you. GreenFox can handle either one, but if you're going to allow, you know, multiple of the same player in your league for different seasons, you need to then maybe modify or create the unique ID and unique lineup name for each of those players, which isn't that difficult if you're using seasons. It's easy to say this is Willie Mays 1954 as opposed to the Willie Mays 57 or however you want to do it. So you just have to tweak those names so that you can tell which player is which. In the last type of custom roster I listed here as fictional players, but really it's any and all combinations of historical and fictional players, whatever you want, from Major League Baseball history, maybe from the Negro Leagues, the Federal League, the Looney Tunes League of Bugs Bunny, the TV show League of Sam Malone, or the Silver Screen League with Roy Hobbs, or maybe it's just you and your pet, or whatever. Any name or you can just put in anybody you want. It doesn't matter. But obviously, if it's not a historical player, you might have to. You got to provide all that information because it won't be able to find it on the retro sheet website. Okay, so let's delve into these roster types a little more specifically, I guess you'd say. Let's first look at entering historical team rosters in GreenFox. So if you have historical team rosters, whether they're all from the same season or different seasons, that doesn't matter here. But as long as they're rosters based on a historical team in Major League Baseball between 1901 and 2023, then GreenFox has what I would say is quite helpful way to help you out entering those rosters by basically using the retro sheet data and the Sean Lehman database data to provide that historical roster as a starting point, and then you could modify that as needed. And I think from a practical standpoint, let's say I've got a Stratomatic league and I'm going to have the 1968 Tigers as one of my teams in my league. I could load the 1968 Tigers official roster from this file that you can download from the GreenFox Facebook group here. The name of that file is this gf2 underscore retro rosters.xlsm. And once you download that and have it open, and within the GreenFox sheet itself, it can access the data in there, and it could load your team roster, whatever team you choose. And as an example, you load a team, and it'll likely have more players than you may have in your game, and you would likely delete some players from that historical roster until it got down to or matched whatever you had in your game or whatever you wanted to use in your game. So let's look at a couple of screenshots from GreenFox of how that would work. So as far as the workflow of historical team rosters in GreenFox. So this is on the rosters sheet itself in GreenFox. This shows a couple of things. So one is when you want to add players, you first have to unlock this sheet. That's what this button does here. You can see it kind of gives you this status. And then you have the ability to load a historical team roster. And when you click this button here, it'll first look for this file, this GreenFox Retro Rosters file, to make sure it's open. If it's not, it'll give you a little error message. But you have to make sure that's open. It can be minimized. It doesn't have to be in the front, but it just has to be open so that the code in GreenFox can find it. So once you click this button and this file is open, this window over here will pop up. It's called the historical roster chooser. User form is what Excel calls it, but I typically would just call it a pop-up window, or some people call it a dialog box. But anyway, it's this window that pops up, and this is where you basically all the magic happens. Where here is a drop-down list where you could pick which team in your league you're trying to load the roster for. So here I showed, okay, I'm loading the 1984 Detroit Tigers. So then I choose them here, and then in this list box it lists all the years from 1901 to 2023. So I'd find the year, select that, and once you pick the year, it'll then show all the teams that were in Major League Baseball that year, and then you'd pick your team. And when you do that, it lists your historical team roster here. And once you have that chosen, you click the load button, and it'll basically then prompt you for a confirmation. Say, hey, do you want to load this historical roster for this team of yours in your league? And you'd likely say yes, and it'll just instantly drop all those players onto the roster sheet. And then once you do load it for one team, you could then go up here and switch it to a different team, find the year, and that team, repeat until you got all your teams in there. It does have a little error, or it's trying to error prevention, I would say, where it'll let you know if you're trying to load a roster and there are already entries on your roster's sheet. It'll say, hey, there's already players on that roster sheet. Are you sure you want to do this? Just so you don't accidentally load the same team 2 times, or accidentally load a historical roster for the wrong team. So anyway, that's how that works in GreenFox. Like I said, you would typically load the historical roster and then pare it down by deleting the players that you're not going to use for your game or your league until it basically until the roster matches what you want it to be. So the next type of roster I want to talk about here is rosters that are made up of historical players, but not necessarily all from a single historical team. So if you have historical players from a single or multiple seasons, that doesn't matter, but GreenFox does provide what I will call a built-in player copy-paste feature to copy individual players into your GreenFox custom league rosters worksheet to build up your rosters. And it uses that same file as we just talked about for the historical teams, which is that GF2 Retro Rosters spreadsheet. So let's take a look at how that looks inside GreenFox. So this is showing 2 things here. On the left is the rosters sheet, kind of like what we were just looking at before, and over on the right is the GF2 Retro Rosters Excel workbook. And specifically within that, this is what's called the R rosters sheet, which stands for the retro rosters sheet or tab. And what I try to show with these numbers is the steps it takes to do it. So this on this R rosters sheet, it it lists here. I believe there's over 100,000 names in these rosters from 1901 to 2023. So it's a pretty big list. But I will point out there are these filters up here if you want to use them to try to find your player faster, whether it be in a given year or for a team or whatever you want. This I have in this example I had set for the 1976 Tigers, so you could see that. But anyway, so you can, but the steps that you need to follow would be, the first thing would be is to click this copy player mode button, step one, and that will set this to on. I think it defaults to off. Then over here in the roster sheet, you'd click this toggle paste player mode, and that will turn this on. That's step two. So that basically sets it up so you can copy and paste. And ideally, you can have each of these on half of your screen, or if you have two screens, you can have one on one and one on the other, because it does make it easier if you can see both of these at the same time. Maybe you can just make them small enough so that you can fit them on your screen. But anyway, so from there, on the historical rosters sheet, you find your player and you click on that player's lineup name. You have to click the lineup name for this to work. And you'll know it's active when you click on the name. It'll put this kind of dotted line around, I think there's 10 fields here, starting with their player ID, their name, you know, their role as pitcher, hitter, what they bat, what they throw, their position list, and you can't see it here, but there's also the pitcher role that would show whether they were a starter or reliever or both that season. But basically, all that information is copied. And then you'd go over here to your roster sheet and click on, probably I would say the first, it doesn't have to be the first, but I would say it makes sense to be your first blank lineup name. And when you click there, it'll paste all this information over here. It doesn't paste the team because it doesn't know what team these players are on, because you're copying individual players. So you have to fill in this team over here. But it'll copy all the player info. So depending on your situation, you'd have to decide whether you want to use this feature or whether you want to just type them in yourself. If you want to use the positions that a player historically played, or as far as what they bat and threw or all that stuff, that's up to you whether you think you want to use this feature or not. But it's available. And the last thing I'll say is, as far as the rosters go, if you're going to go with these fictional players, then you're pretty much on your own. You'll have to just manually enter all that information for those players on those teams in the roster sheet itself, as this says here. I'll show in this next slide. You could do it once here, or if you already have it in some other spreadsheet or something, you could put it all together in one place. And this is strongly suggesting that when you enter it, you have these columns in this order. The specific order of the team ID, player ID, blah 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 blah. Over here to the pitcher, I think there are 10 columns here. So you'd want to, if you have it someplace else, I'd make sure you have it in these columns in this exact order, so that from wherever you have it, you could copy it and paste it in here, and everything would match up with the correct column. The last thing I want to mention with custom roster entry here, which talks about the custom ratings, which are optional, but I wanted to mention them here because they're shown on the roster sheet, which is this information, this custom rating or info columns, You don't need to worry about it this time. I would highly recommend do that later, and don't even worry about doing anything with it at this point. Just get your team rosters set up first, and then you can worry about these player ratings later if you're going to use them at all. One more item I don't want to forget as far as adding in this roster player manually is that this multi-team list column, although it does get copied and pasted using the GreenFox copy paste feature, this doesn't mean anything in a custom league. So you can, if you're manually entering it, you don't have to do it. And the positions here and the pitcher role, they're not required, but they're very helpful in the game flow. If when you're making a substitution in your game, it'll list these positions. So sometimes that's very helpful to know what positions a guy or a player can play based on whether it's based on historical or if it's fictional, your made up player. But typically, every guy can't play every position. So that's what this position and this pitcher role would be, what indicate whether they're a starter, reliever, or both. But that's what those fields are helpful, especially in defining who your starters are, as well as starting pitchers go. But also when you're making substitutions of what positions a player can play or who are relief pitchers, etc. So that's what I wanted to mention on those fields. And over here, this primary role, this is absolutely mandatory, whether they're a pitcher, a hitter, or they could be B, which is both, kind of like the Otani rule or the 1918 Babe Ruth. That does both. And this bats and throws, if you're gonna, it's critical that you have these in here if you're gonna have a league that uses the lefty righty split information, because then it needs to know what a pitcher throws so it knows which lineup you're going to use. So we'll get to that later, but I wanted to mention it here of why they're important and when. Okay, well that's all I've got about the rosters. Now on to stage 3, which is the split stats or the lefty righty and team lineups. So the basic question of will your league play incorporate lefty righty splits? Or another way to ask the question would be, will the outcome of the pitcher batter plate appearance in your game depend on whether the pitcher is a lefty or a righty or what the batter is? And based on that answer, you need to set your GreenFox custom league up accordingly. So there are two things that impacts. One is there's a game option in GreenFox for the lefty righty lineups, and secondly would be just the what default lineups you need to set up or create for each team. So let's look at what it looks like in GreenFox on the options sheet or the options tab in GreenFox. This is game option number 10. Which you can see here it says, auto load the versus lefty or versus righty lineup based on the opposing starting pitcher. And it shows that this is only a custom league feature. And the explanation of it over here, I'll jump because it's off. I'll read this first. You should set it to off if your league does not use lefty righty batter pitcher matchups to determine the batter result. And when it is off, the default lineup will be the lefty or the versus lefty lineup on the LG lineup sheet. But if it's on, then when it loads a new game to the spreadsheet, GreenFox will automatically load the preset lineup versus lefty or versus righty depending on what the opposing starting pitcher is. So that's important to set this game option based on how your league or game works. And so the second part of that has to do with the lineups. And this is in GreenFox, this is the LG lineup sheet or tab. We'll call your league custom league lineups. And this is just kind of a annotated version to show kind of how it works. Over on the left here will be the column of all the teams in your league. They can either be expanded or collapsed. Right now, the Expos are expanded, even though there's no lineup configured for them yet. But you can click either the name or the ID, and that'll toggle whether it'll expand or collapse a team. Each team can have up to 4 lineups. There's the versus lefty, the versus righty, lineup 3, and lineup 4, which you can't see. And you basically click that name, and it'll launch the lineup editor. And each one also can have a little note that you might write in of something about it. I could see, especially that could be for lineup 3 or 4, of what that is. Maybe this is my lineup versus lefty when the lefty is, worse against left-handed batters or something like that. Or you might say this is my lineup. Well, this player's hurt for 15 games. I'm going to use this lineup against lefties, or whatever, something like that. So this is where you would the sheet in GreenFox where it basically tracks all the default lineups for all the teams. And I should also mention that these are the lineups, but once you load a lineup for a game, you can still modify it if you'd like to. But the idea is that you don't want to manually create every lineup for every game, I don't think. So let's take a look at when you click one of these versus lefty or versus righty, that will launch this lineup editor. So let's see what that looks like. And this is what it looks like. This is the lineup editor pop-up window or user form within GreenFox. So a few of the features that you can have up to 4 lineups. It works with one lineup at a time, but you can edit either one. It does position validation. You can have a pitcher or a DH. It doesn't force the pitcher to be in the 9th spot, but I think highly recommend that you do for other score sheet reasons. And it will let you copy a lineup also. So you can see here that when you first load it, it'll list all the players whose primary role on your roster is a batter or hitter over here. And then you use these buttons to bring them into the lineup or take them out of the lineup. But basically you start by putting them in. When it puts them in, it just drops them to the bottom, and then this isn't drag and drop. You basically have to click on it, the player, and you can click these buttons if you want to move them up or down in the lineup, or you can double click to move them to the top or the bottom. And then once you get them where you want them, you highlight the player and then click this little position layout over here to say what position they're playing, or at least going to start in the lineup. So that's how you would define the batting order and what position each person is playing. And then when you hit save and close, that's when it does the validation, and it'll automatically make sure that you don't have any duplicates, that nothing's missing, or it won't let you save it. You can cancel out of it, but it won't save it. And you can see here it kind of lets you, if you wanted to copy it, maybe you want to copy your righty lineup from your lefty if they're almost the same, then you can just make a couple tweaks, or similar, you could do that here. So this is where you'd create your lineups. One other thing I'll mention about the lineups is that you don't need to create for sure all 4 lineups for each team. If you're going to use lefty-righty splits, then you should make a lefty and a righty lineup for each team. But if you don't have to do them all at the beginning, you could wait until that team plays its first game, and right before that, that's when you could create your lineups. It doesn't require that they all be created before you start the first game of your league. And similarly, you could modify the lineups at any time during your league, but and if you're not using the lefty-righty splits, you only really need the versus lefty will be the primary lineup, but doesn't stop you from creating a versus righty or a lineup 3 or 4 either if you'd like to. Okay, that brings us to stage 4 in this process of the schedule. So I've listed here some main things about the schedule, which is relatively manual. As I said, the GreenFox does not provide a schedule creation tool, but it has some, I think, what I would call some benefits regarding the flexibility of the schedule for a custom league. Listed here first, it does not need to be entered in any specific order. It does not need to be completed before the league starts. You could just have one game if you want to, and you can add games as you go. You can play the games in any order you'd like to. One thing it does require is that every game on the schedule in a custom league has to have these 5 fields populated. The game ID, which has to be unique, the home team ID, the visiting team ID, and the home team starting pitcher lineup name and the visitor starter lineup name. That's the bare minimum you need to have a game on the schedule. And there are several other optional fields that you may want to populate, such as ballpark, day or night, whatever, but they're not required. And this bottom is just what I already said about the schedule, lack of a schedule maker. Let's look at the schedule sheet in GreenFox, which is called the SCAD or SHAD or whatever sheet. And I've put some annotation on here to try to explain a few things. But within the custom league, it highlights these 5 required fields in yellow. And that's why they're like that. The other ones are basically optional. These 2 that show the home and visiting team are auto-populated when you validate the schedule, so you don't have to worry about filling those in either. In this little example here, I had 3 games on the schedule. The first game was completed. You can see how it has, when you complete a game from the score sheet and save the stats, it fills this in, and you can see it writes in the date of the sim game, and it also fills in the final score. It kind of color codes the winner and the loser, and it'll also update this little table up here of the number of completed games. And in order to modify your schedule, kind of like the roster, you need to unlock it, then make your changes, and then lock it. And every time you lock it, it'll validate it and make sure that things look legit. It won't lock it in if it finds a problem. So this just kind of indicates this is a completed game, and these game 2 and 3 are both scheduled games. And that's really it. Like I said, this is probably one of the more manual parts of it, but I feel like there's some beneficial trade-off there in that it's flexible, that you don't have to have it all figured out at the beginning. You can do it as you go. One more thing I'll mention regarding about the schedule, especially with the starting pitchers, is these lineup names, must match the lineup names on the roster exactly. So if you have extra letters or whatever, if they don't match exactly, it won't pass the validation. It'll tell you, I can't find this player on the roster. You'll have to fix it. Last but not least is stage 5, which is the player info ratings feature. And as mentioned here, it is totally optional. It can be entered and modified at any time throughout the course of your league. You can enter it for some players, but not other players. And there are various examples in different games of what types of info ratings you may want to use. You can enter up to, there are 4 different columns for batters and 5 different for pitchers. But especially for batters, you can control the width of the column, so you could actually fit three ratings in one column if you wanted to. But and I list some examples here of what types of possible ratings you could use for this. But I'm not going to go into the details for it now because I've already created a thorough video that talks about this, goes through the step by step demonstration of how to incorporate these custom ratings into the GreenFox League play. But I do have a little bit more, I guess I'll say, advice or insight regarding this, and I would say, and it's just a recommendation, and that what I would say is because entering it, this data for your players can be a significant task, well, time wise, and therefore I do strongly recommend that before you start any of that work, just if once you get your league set up, would be to play a couple of games and use that to determine what player info or rating you think you really need. And I would say only enter it if it's really going to significantly improve your game flow or your game experience. I think it can kind of be alluring to say, oh yeah, I could put it in as stealing or this or that, but you know, in my experience, although I've only I haven't played 500 games using GreenFox, but I've played a few. I would say you're still going to be playing your game, so it's not like you don't have access to your game information. And if if the information is readily available on your cards or whatever it is a game you're playing, then having it on the score sheet isn't that much of a value add. But if it really is saving you looking something up or having to, you know, stop what you're doing and pick up some other stuff to go look up something in some chart or blah blah blah, then it might be a significant help to you and worthwhile to have that readily available on the score sheet, whatever that rating is. So that's my big recommendation on this is that don't dive in, you know, right away. I'd first play some games and really try to figure out what's really gonna be beneficial to you in playing your games, and not just what's available. But if it isn't going to make a big difference, I don't think it's a good use of your time. But that's up to you. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it helpful.
That wraps up this video. Thanks again for watching, and please feel free to leave me some feedback regarding what you like about the video, what you like about the spreadsheet, and just as important, what you don't like and ways you think it could even be better. Thanks again.